everyone. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today. The topic of the day is an overview of the Functional Safety Lifecycle as defined by IEC 61511 and how we tackle these different phases with exSILentia. We're going to focus on the analysis phase, so that's PHA, LOPA, SIL selection, and SRS. Before we jump into the topic, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Kate Hildenbrand. I'm a product manager at exida, responsible for our exSILentia tools. So that means that I define requirements for new functionality within the software, as well as optimizing existing functionality. I also do training on the lifecycle tasks using exSILentia, and I help with software support. I have my email address here at the bottom of the slide. If you have any questions on this webinar, on the software, or on exida at large, please do not hesitate to use this email address to reach out to me. I can help answer your question or find the right person to do so. I'd like to give a little bit of an overview of our company before we get started as well. So exida has three main functional groups. We create software, and we have a consulting team that help to address the different tasks of the functional safety lifecycle, as well as alarm rationalization and cybersecurity. We also have a certification team that does FMEDA analysis on devices used across industries for safety instrumented systems. Our CERT team also certifies personnel, so we have our CFSE and our CACE programs that would help you get certified. Again, in this way, we're focusing on alarm management, cybersecurity, and functional safety, among others. With an overview of the functional safety lifecycle. Typically, when we talk about the lifecycle, we see an image like this. In fact, I think this comes straight from the standard. And it's really a top-down list of all the different tasks needed to define any potential hazard scenarios within an application or a process, to determine protection layers against that hazard scenario, to communicate the design criteria for those protection layers, and then ultimately install a safety instrumented system and bring it online. After FATs and SATs, you would be able to bring your safety instrumented system online and then document the performance of the safety instrumented system by making sure to collect all data on process demands, on failures, and proof test performance. If your safety instrumented system isn't performing as assumed, you can make modifications to it with an MOC process. And ultimately, at the end of the life of your safety instrumented system, you would do decommissioning. And so this really looks like a checklist of tasks that you can complete. But from a data flow perspective, we really do see this as a cycle. And so within exSILentia, the objective of a fully integrated safety lifecycle tool is to allow any critical data from one task to be automatically moved to the next task in order to jumpstart that task, save time, but also improve traceability and make sure your information is consistent. Well, if you're in your process hazard analysis and you are documenting any potential hazards, the cause of those hazards and the potential consequences, as well as any safeguards you have against those hazards, you would be able to determine for high-risk scenarios what critical data you want to move over to the LOPA. So for those high-risk scenarios, your causes would become initiating events, and your safeguards that you documented will move over as potential independent protection layers. Those protection layers could be anything from alarms to relief devices to safety instrumented functions. IPLs that are safety instrumented functions, you would be able to determine the target risk reduction factor and target safety integrity level in the SIL selection tool. This can be done using your LOPA results, using risk matrix methodology or risk graph methodology. Once you've determined all of that for your safety instrumented function, you would be able to document all requirements needed to be communicated to the design team within the SRS module. This really addresses every single requirement called out by the standard to include in your safety requirement specification in order to be compliant to the standard, but also to effectively communicate what is needed for the SIF to properly bring the process back to the safe state in the face of a hazard. So these modules are what we would use to address the analysis phase of the safety lifecycle. Once this is complete and you move on to design, you would have all of this information on hand in the same project file to be able to reference as you determine how you're going to build your SIF. In the design phase, you're going to model your SIF. You're going to determine the architecture of your SIF, including any redundancy you might have. You're going to specify the specific equipment you're using. Through the proof test procedure for that equipment, you're going to know the proof test coverage, and you get to define the proof test strategy, so how often you're going to be doing functional tests on these devices. Your results from your design are going to be an achieved SIL level and an achieved risk reduction factor, among the many results that SIL verification outputs. Once your design is complete, you want to be able to communicate requirements for implementation. And once your safety instrumented system is installed and online, you want to be able to effectively test it with the right proof test procedures. You want to be able to collect data over the life of the system to validate the assumptions made in analysis and design. And so our O&M tool would help to close that gap in the cycle to make sure that your field data really matches the data that you used in your LOPA and your SIL verification. When it comes to our fully integrated lifecycle tool, we really see the safety lifecycle as a cycle. On those tasks in the analysis phase and see exactly how we would handle them using exSILentia. When we talk about the analysis phase, we're focusing on these top 3 sections of the life cycle. And this includes a hazard and risk assessment in the PHA. Then allocation of safety functions to protection layers in the layer of protection analysis. And finally, documentation of requirements for the safety instrumented system in the SRS, which is fueled also by SIL selection in determining the integrity requirements for your SIF. And so we're going to take a deep dive into these tasks in order to see what they entail and how you can handle them using the exSILentia software. What are we doing in each of these tasks? For the process hazard analysis, you're taking your process, whether it be in the form of a PNID or any other reference documents, and you're breaking it down into smaller pieces. We call these units and nodes. For each piece of your process, you're going to brainstorm all possible hazards that could occur while this process is online. And so for each process parameter, you're going to say, if there was a challenge to that process parameter, could it result in a hazard? What would be the cause of the hazard, the consequence of it happening, and what are possible safeguards against it? In the layer of protection analysis, you're trying to determine for high-risk scenarios, which of those safeguards are independent and can effectively protect against that high-risk hazard. Independent protection layers are going to be SIFs. And for those SIFs, we are going to need to determine the target SIL and the target risk reduction factor for that SIF in order to let the design team know what to design. And so we do that in SIL selection. This is where you're determining the integrity requirements for that SIF. And you can do that based on your LOPA results. You can do it with a risk graph or a risk matrix within exSILentia. Once integrity requirements are determined, you can document all additional requirements in the safety requirement specification. As I mentioned, IEC 61511 has a number of requirements that are required for or mandatory for this document in order to effectively communicate to the design team what needs to be done in SIL verification. And so this is used almost as a checklist to make sure each of those requirements are addressed. This is going to generate a nice report, and it's also going to be on hand when you use the Silver module to design your SIFs. So let's take a look at how we would do this in exSILentia. From a high-level perspective, when it comes to your PHA, the first thing you're going to do is define your units. You're going to define any nodes or equipment within your unit. And for each node, you're going to determine what are the different deviations or challenges to process parameters that could potentially result in a hazard. So this deviation is really answering the question, what could go wrong? So here you'll see, for example, for a reactor, we have 26 deviations to consider. Maybe not all of them will result in any hazards to document. And so you can indicate that within the tool that it was considered and there are no potential hazards for that deviation. For the ones that do have potential hazards, you can go on to document the cause of the hazard. Why did this go wrong? What could possibly occur within my process to cause this hazard scenario or to cause the challenge to the process parameter? Cause, you can document a likelihood of the cause. Is this very likely to happen or not very likely at all? Document the consequence. There might be multiple consequences in this case, and each can have their own category. Could this impact us on a safety level? Could people get hurt? Could this impact us on an environmental level? Could we hurt the environment through this hazard? Or even a business level, can we destroy any equipment or possibly even just have downtime in our process that would be costly? Each of these consequences, we can specify a severity level. Is this a small consequence with low severity, or could it possibly be a high severity consequence? And together with the likelihood, that would help us output a risk. Now, the likelihood, severity, and risk are really based off of your own corporate criteria, which is easy to set up within exSILentia. And that risk is going to help to determine if this is a serious enough scenario to keep on documenting safeguards and recommendations within the PHA. So once we know how bad the consequence is, we can move on to documenting safeguards. If it's a high-risk scenario, how do we protect against it? Is there anything already in the design that's going to help bring the process back to the safe state or mitigate the harm of the consequence? Anything from alarms with operator response. They can be relief devices, safety instrumented functions. You could have procedures in place that are safeguards. You can do operator training. You can even have physical security as safeguards. So you might have quite a bit to document here. You're going to document your resulting likelihood now that the safeguards are considered. So the cause has a likelihood, but now that we have safeguards to protect against the hazard, what is the resulting likelihood with safeguards? And that's going to output a risk with safeguards that will again help you to determine if this is a high-risk scenario and should you keep on documenting recommendations or even move on to the layer of protection analysis. Once we know how we can protect against it, you might want to learn more. And that's where the recommendations come in. Is there any more investigating that needs to be done, whether it be on the cause, the consequence, or the safeguards themselves? And here's where you basically are listing action items that you can assign to team members. You can give them a priority and a due date, and you can follow up on these to make sure that you have all the details handled in order to feel confident in your PHA analysis. Risk scenarios, you might decide to move on to the LOPA. And in this case, you can indicate that within the tool, and you can define a hazard scenario for your cause-consequence pair. This can be a dedicated hazard scenario for that cause-consequence pair, or you can apply one hazard scenario to multiple cause-consequence pairs. And what that means is, from a LOPA perspective, you can have a hazard scenario with one initiating event each, or you can have multiple initiating events per hazard scenario. And this is really up to you and your methodology, perhaps even your application. The tool can handle either one, and so it accommodates both. But when you move on to the LOPA module, the first thing you're going to see is all of your hazard scenarios listed here. In the screenshot, you can see there's only one. So this is a simple example, but often you would have a number of hazard scenarios listed here. So that's automatically going to move over once it's defined in the PHA. If you would like to bring any other vital information from the PHA, you would simply have to click this button or this button. One brings over information for all hazard scenarios at once, and one brings over information for one at a time. And once you do that, your causes are going to move over to the LOPA as initiating events. The initiating event can be given a frequency. You can enter it directly or use our database to determine the frequency of this initiating event. So your safeguards are going to move over as potential IPLs. I say potential because you only want to give credit to safeguards that are independent. So you'll first put them in order of how they're expected to respond to the hazard, and then you can give them a probability of failure. And the initiating event frequency, along with the probability of failure of the IPLs, is going to help calculate your hazard scenario frequency. And so you can see that here, per severity category, we have calculated a hazard scenario frequency. And the goal is to have that meet the target frequency that you have determined is tolerable for this kind of hazard scenario. So again, that's based on your corporate criteria that you can enter in at the start of the project. And if your hazard scenario frequency is not meeting your target frequency, you're going to have a resulting risk reduction factor that's needed. So that would mean that perhaps you don't have enough protection layers, or perhaps you don't know the target risk reduction factor of any safety instrumented functions yet. So within LOPA, you would be able to leave that in the hazard scenario before you move on to SIL selection as a remaining RRF for the hazard scenario. Or in the LOPA, you could already attribute that to the SIF to help determine your target risk reduction factor for that SIF. So that's something you can do with a calculator button that's basically going to force the hazard scenario frequency to meet the target frequency. You move over to SIL selection, you will already see that calculated LOPA RRF. If you choose not to calculate it within the LOPA, you're going to see a remaining RRF here and for the hazard scenario. But if you do choose to calculate it in the LOPA, you'll see that LOPA RRF per SIF, and you can use that to determine the target frequency. You could either have it match, or perhaps you want to be a little conservative and bump it up to the next level to ensure that the SIL level covers that SIF and the associated hazard scenario. It's important to mention that within exSILentia, if you have a SIF in multiple hazard scenarios, it will use the worst case scenario in order to determine your target risk reduction factor. So that is something it is able to account for. These integrity requirements are going to be included in the SRS when you move over to that module, as well as the demand rate calculated based off of your LOPA analysis. In the SRS, you basically have a template that has a field for every requirement called out by IEC 61511 to be included in the SRS document to communicate to the design team how the SIF needs to be modeled. So you'll be able to put in here intended proof test strategy, intended mission time, intended sensor legs and final element legs, as well as your target RRF and your target SIL. And so that's going to help them know exactly how to design. They need to meet or exceed these parameters in order to reach that target SIL with their achieved SIL or achieved RRF. So this is going to generate a nice consistent report that can be used to communicate these requirements out. It's also going to be at your fingertips if you're using exSILentia for the team that is designing the SIF and SIL verification. So it's very easy to just click into the next module and see exactly what the requirements are, see exactly what hazard scenarios the SIF is expected to respond to, and why the design criteria is what it is. So that in a nutshell is how we would do that in exSILentia. To really give you an idea of how this would be done with a practical example, I have put together this batch reactor here that can be used to sort of guide us through exactly how this would be done within the tool. This batch reactor is basically mixing feed A with feed B in a reactor that has a jacket where you would be able to control temperature with a flow of chilled water as well as hot water coming in. The product is going to be transferred with this transfer pump to storage. And if anything goes wrong, there is a quench tank that can be used. It's 4 times the volume of the reactor, where you can dump the contents of the reactor in case of a hazard scenario. You can see here we have a few pressure transmitters. We have PT500, which will open a vent valve to vent to an incinerator. We have another pressure transmitter that is going to both have a high pressure alarm on it, a high pressure alarm, and also enact an interlock that will open this valve to the quench tank if the pressure reaches a high enough value. We have a rupture disc here that will lift at 60 psig, as you can see there. We also have level transmitters that will help to control the different feed lines for feed A and B, and also the dump to the quench tank. And there is also a temperature sensor that will help to determine how much chilled water or how much hot water should be maintained in that jacket. Of this example, we're going to focus on a high pressure scenario. So for this example, normal operating pressure is 10 psig. If it is 15 psig, your first high pressure alarm will sound because of this pressure transmitter. The only way the pressure is really going to get too high is if this valve is blocked or breaks somehow. And so if the pressure gets a bit high, this is supposed to open to vent to the incinerator. And you'd really only reach 15 psig in this example is if this fails. And so if this fails, you have a high pressure alarm going at 15 psig. You have a high pressure alarm if it reaches 20 psig. You will also have the pressure transmitter signal enact opening the valve to dump to the quench tank at 20 psig. And then finally, if it reaches 60 psig, you're going to have this rupture disc lift in order to relieve the pressure in the reactor. And so using this example, let's open up exSILentia and determine exactly how we would do this within the tool. Let me open up exSILentia here. I have a sample project already ready for this batch reactor. We're going to walk through it from scratch to a degree. You can see my instance of exSILentia here. This is the dashboard. This is going to show all of your different project configuration options. It has the library, it has a LOPA database and your failure rate database. And up top, you can see all the different modules almost in a tab-like format. While I want to jump right into the PHA, I do first want to show you some of the project setup information. So first, I'm going to go to the project configuration. And here you can see a place where much of the information that you want to feed into or defaults that you want to use can be defined. The first thing you'll notice here is plant types. For each plant type, we have a number of process types. And these are meant to help define your application or process within the tool. What you're seeing here are exida defaults that can be fully configured by you. So you can delete everything here if you prefer and start from scratch by adding in what you'd like to see. You can reorder what you see here. And the same goes for the process types. And so when you define your unit, you would be able to choose a plant type and a process type to help give a little extra information on exactly what the PHA is addressing. For nodes, you're allowed to define different node types here. And for each node type, you can define a number of default deviations. And so these will automatically show up upon definition of your node when you specify your node type as deviations that you should consider in your PHA before moving on. Again, we have defaults in here with the exida project, but you can add to it. You can delete what we have. You can reorder things just to make sure that any deviation that you want to make sure is addressed for different node types is in this list and as you go through your PHA. Obviously, more deviations can be added on the fly while you're in the module, but this is a nice way to ensure that certain things are being considered during your process hazard analysis. I also like to show the risk configuration. Within the risk configuration, you're able to define the different severity categories that you want to consider during your PHA and LOPA. And so by default, we have business, environment, and safety. And for each of these, we have 6 different levels that go from no impact to high severity. Each level has a tolerable frequency that can be defined for that severity level. This would all be based on your corporate criteria. So these are here by default in the project, but you would be able to add as many severity categories as you'd like. You can delete these, you can rename them to match your own internal standard or procedure for this. You'd also be able to define your tolerable frequencies that go along with the different severity levels. Next, in the severity matrix, you can give detailed description of each level for each category. So here, by default, level 1 for business is negligible impact. Level 6 is anything that costs over $150 million. And we have levels in between. For environment, we have everything from negligible impact to permanent damage to the environment, rendering the land unusable. So that's what we see as the highest severity possible for environment. And then finally, for safety, we have recordable injuries, we have irreversible injuries, and then on-site and off-site fatalities. And so these descriptions can be defined by you. And when you're in the PHA choosing the different severities, you'll be able to see the descriptions so that you know exactly which level to choose. You can do the same for likelihood. You can define as many levels as you like. You can give them a code and a name. And then in the likelihood matrix, you would be able to give them a description. This can be qualitative or quantitative, whatever, again, matches your own corporate criteria. Of risk levels that you can define, and here you would be able to define your risk matrix. So for each severity and each likelihood intersection, what is the resulting risk that you would like to report out? You can include SIL levels with the different risk levels if you're doing SIL selection due to risk matrix, or if you prefer not to see that, you can exclude them. We are trying to make this as customizable as possible, so you really can choose any color for your different risk levels to match your own risk matrix that you're used to. Likewise, you'd be able to change the risk matrix configuration to make sure that at a glance it looks like the risk matrix that you're accustomed to referencing. So all of this is project setup that you would be able to do on your own within exSILentia. If every new project that you define uses the same criteria for project configuration and risk configuration, you would be able to easily pull that into a new project with all of the information in the module still blank, but your configuration intact to get started. This is because we don't want you to have to do this over and over again every project. We want to save you some time. And so there's an option when you open a new project to bring in the risk configuration and project configuration from a previously defined project. Now, if you're changing your criteria from project to project, it should be easy enough to come in here and configure this quickly. Let's jump into the PHA and see exactly how we would handle this batch reactor. Already in my project, I have the unit defined. So here I give it a name, batch reactor unit. I have a plant type, I chose chemical, and a process type, I chose polymers, and then a process mode, I chose batch. So these are really just meant as reference to help define my unit along with the process description. So here we talk a little bit about the batch reactor, mixing materials A and B, exactly what the application is that we're analyzing here. Then with the node, we have the ability to give it a name, an intention, any comments, and then the node type. In order to really give you an idea of how this works, in the navigation tree, I'll expand the unit. You can see my unit and my node. I'm going to define another reactor within my unit to give you an idea of how that works. So here we'll call this reactor 2. A little detail here. Just a simple sample. And then I can give it a type. So for the type, I'll choose reactor. And you can see my worksheet is populating here. You'll see both of my nodes here. And if I expand my new node, you'll see the default deviations that were populated as soon as I chose that node type. So for reactors, there's 26 deviations that we feel are worth considering when doing the PHA. Again, not all of these deviations will necessarily have a hazard scenario associated with it. So for the deviations you would be able to document design intent, you can say if there are no issues. And what's nice about this is instead of deleting the deviation, which leaves no record that you ever considered it, you can simply indicate that it has no issues, and it gives a record that you thought about it within your session and you determined that there are no issues with this deviation. You can also ultimately check if it's complete. Now we know there are issues with high pressure because that's our example in this sample with the batch reactor. So let's make sure to document exactly the scenario for that. In this case, for high pressure, the first thing I want to do is add a cause. And this cause would be in the event of the vent valve PIC 500 breaking so that it can no longer vent to the incinerator if there is high pressure in the reactor. So I'll say PIC 500 is blocked and cannot vent to incinerator. Next, I can choose a likelihood for this cause. So we think it's pretty likely that this would happen. So I'll choose the high likelihood. So then we want to be able to document a consequence. And this consequence would be that there is, due to decomposition, in the reactor. So in this case, you can see that all 3 of my severity categories are enabled. And so if I would like to just focus on business, environment, or safety, I can disable the other ones. So let's say in this case, we're worried about a safety consequence. I can say, let's not worry about business or environment right now. If you would like to consider all 3, you can easily get them back and you can select them. It's really up to you if you want to have one consequence per severity category or have one consequence consider all 3 severity categories. In this case, let's just say that it's a safety consequence, and I can go back and hide these if I'd like. Then I can choose a severity level for the safety consequence. And here you'll see the different severity levels are tailored to my category choice. So these are my levels according to the safety category. And we'll say that this could cause on-site fatalities. And once I have defined my likelihood and my severity, it will output the risk according to my risk matrix. High risk. So we're going to go ahead and continue to document any possible safeguards in this scenario. I'm going to add a safeguard, and I am going to say that I have a high pressure alarm, if you'll remember. That is going to sound at 15 PSIG. Now, I already have a few safeguards defined within my project. So you can see it's suggesting to me, are you sure this isn't a safeguard that's already been documented? Because if it is, you can link a safeguard from exSILentia's library to multiple places within your PHA. And it will keep track of them such that if you have this alarm considered in multiple places, it knows that it's the same alarm. In this case, though, this is a different alarm. So I am not going to link it. And I'm going to say that the tag for this alarm is PAH501. I'll give it a safeguard category. And this is going to help to determine within exSILentia the data that should move through the lifecycle with this safeguard. So I chose the category alarm. And if I went to view the safeguard, you'll see that all of the information that can go along with the safeguard is shown here for an alarm. So alarms come with some high-level fields that you can fill out for the PHA if you want to document the immediate or potential ultimate consequence for this specific alarm. You can link references from the library. If we do LOPA analysis with this alarm, that data will be shown here. And then we have custom data for the alarm. This custom data is shown here. And what custom data means is in the project configuration, you are able to specify fields that you would like to attribute to safeguards or even the SRS that aren't already included within the tool. So if you find that you would like to document something that there isn't a field for in exSILentia, you would be able to define that field and link it to a safeguard. And so here you'll see we have text fields, we have checkboxes, we have the ability to define yes or no fields. And in this case, this is some information that might pertain to alarm rationalization in the future. And so if you have the time within your PHA and you want to document this, you can. And it'll move throughout the lifecycle with this alarm. For my example, we also have a high pressure alarm that is going to sound at 20 PSIG. I'll give this category alarm too. You see the CD button will allow you to just see the custom data quickly if you want to fill it out instead of opening the entire safeguard. Finally, you'll be able to document here that there is an interlock where PT501 is going to open XV500 to dump the contents of the reactor into the quench tank. So for this, I'll just call it a high pressure protection. Might use the terminology IPF for this because we don't yet know if it has any target risk reduction factor or target SIL. For the sake of simplicity in this case, I'm already going to call it a SIF. I'll call it SIF 501. But I'm going to give it that category of IPF. And you'll notice that within exSILentia, IPF safeguards have quite a bit of data that moves throughout the life cycle with it. So here you'll see the same PHA fields, but you'll also see some SRS fields, your LOPA analysis fields, and your integrity requirements. These aren't filled out because I just defined the SIF. But as you move through the life cycle, you'll start to see this information captured within this view, within the library, and anywhere else where you see the safeguard. On the other side is some of the silver information. You'll see our defaults are filled in already. But as you move on to the design phase, you'll be able to fill this in and see it at a glance in this view as well. I'm going to document my rupture disk. So we have a rupture disk. Give it PSE 500 in this case. And we'll define it as a rupture disk. And here we've documented all of our safeguards. You'll see each safeguard has an ID, and that is because, again, the tool is able to keep track of each individual one as it moves through the life cycle. So if I assign this SIF to another cause-consequence pair, and it ends up in my LOPA, it will know that that's the same SIF, and when it comes to defining integrity requirements, it will be able to present the worst-case scenario to make sure that it is designed for all of the scenarios that it's a part of. Any change I would make to that SIF in this place would also change in all places that it is a part of. So if I see that I made a typo or put the wrong tag in, and I've already linked it in multiple places, instead of having to go back through and correct that, you just correct it once and it updates. And so this is helping with traceability and consistency throughout the lifecycle task. Already defined a SIF or any safeguard that I wanted to attribute to this consequence, I would be able to click this link button, and you can see all of the different safeguards in the library. If you have a long list, you would be able to also search that list. So I can say rupture, and you can see the other rupture disk that's in my library. Previously defined, it has a different tag number, so I know that's not the one I want. But if I did, I could hit add. Want to specify a likelihood now that the safeguards are in place. And so we can do that here. And it'll output a resulting risk with safeguards. Finally, we can move on to document any recommendations that should be included here. So I can come in here and say, for SIF 501, determine the target risk reduction factor and get. So I can give my recommendation a category. So this might be evaluation. I can assign it to a team member. I can give it a priority. Let's say it's a high priority. I can give it a due date so that it can be tracked over time. I can give it a status. At this point, it's assigned. Just like with the safeguards, if you have any recommendations that you want to share across different places within the PHA, you would be able to come in here and select them. And then in your recommendation list, it doesn't have repeats. It doesn't have the same recommendation listed 4 times because you used it 4 times. It would just have one list of recommendations that you can use to track. Finally, since this is a high-risk scenario, I would like to come in here and say, yes, the LOPA is required, and I want to define a hazard scenario. If I click New Hazard Scenario, it will by default name it my cause name, comma, my consequence name. And so in this case, I would have one hazard scenario per cause consequence pair, or in the LOPA, one initiating event per hazard scenario. I could also click in here and give it a different name that might be more broad that can be applied to multiple cause consequence pairs. And in that case, my resulting LOPA worksheet for that hazard scenario would have multiple initiating events. The tool can accommodate both, so whichever method you prefer to use, you can do. I'm going to leave it named this, and so you would be able to have just one initiating event for the scenario. And that is, in a nutshell, how I would do this with the PHA. Let's say I can't think of any other high-risk, high-pressure scenarios. I can come in here and say it's complete. there are a few options in here that can help to basically determine your preferences. If you don't want autocomplete on, you can turn that off. You saw it happening quite a bit as I was typing in my safeguards. So if that's distracting, you can turn that off. You can determine how you want your severity categories to show up. You can say if you want to be able to type in abbreviations and have it replace it with the whole term, you would be able to do that. You would be able to define bookmarks within exSILentia. So if I want to add a bookmark here to say that this is where I want to start my next session, create that, and then later on you would be able to search your bookmarks. You can also search in general. So if you want to find anything within the tool, you would be able to do that. So I can say high pressure protection, and it'll show me where that is, and it'll allow me to go to select it. And so just a few features within the PHA that will help you to navigate it. When it comes to the different columns, if you prefer not to see some of them, you would be able to turn them off. And so if you have any other questions about the PHA, feel free to reach out. But I'm going to move on to the LOPA. Within the LOPA, once I click on this, you'll be able to see my different hazard scenarios. So this is one I already had in here up top. So you can see the one I just defined right here. And once I click on it, you see that I have a relatively empty worksheet. And so what I can do in this case is I can select this button that loads data from the PHA for the current hazard scenario. If I select this button, you'll see my cause moves over as my initiating event. And all of my safeguards are here as potential IPLs. I can move this so I can see. There is a option to include the safeguard tag here. So I can do that if I want to be able to see the tags that I've defined. In addition to the cause and the safeguards becoming initiating events and IPLs, I also see my selection for severity level come over up top for the hazard scenario. And this is going to populate my target frequency. So you see my target frequency as defined by my risk configuration is 1e to the minus 5. And so I have an RRF of 100,000 here. As I work through the sheet to define the initiating event frequency and the probability of failure for each of my IPLs, we're going to calculate this hazard scenario frequency, and we're hoping that it meets the target frequency or tolerable frequency for this hazard scenario. So the first thing I'm going to do is enter a initiating event frequency. So this is a little bit busy at this point because I'm seeing all of my severity categories, and the one I'm worried about is safety. So I can come in here and hit individual and say that I want to just look at the safety scenario. So that cleans up the sheet a little bit. It's really up to you how you'd like to view it. The 500 being blocked, can't vent to the incinerator. This is really a bit of a failure of the BPCS. And so I can come in here and I can enter directly what I think the frequency is, or I can utilize exida's LOPA database in order to determine what the frequency would be across the industry for something like a control loop failure. In addition to exida's database, there's also the ability to define a user or project-specific database. So if you already have a collection of data that you use within your LOPA analysis that you want to enter into the tool instead of using exida's, you would be able to do that, and it would be accessible right here when you come in to do your LOPA. In this case, what I'm going to do is select this top entry, BPCS control loop failure from the exida database. You'll see it gives it a name. It has references to back up the data. It lists any assumptions that were made and any comments, and it also shows the data point itself. Apply data, and in my worksheet, it'll show those same assumptions, comments, and references. I can add to them if I need to, but this is a nice way to back up the data that you're using. And as soon as I applied that data, you can see that my intermediate frequency is updated, as is my hazard scenario frequency. My RRF just went from 100,000 to 10,000. Make sure that my IPLs are in the order that they're expected to respond to the SIF. So the first one I have is my high pressure alarm, then my high pressure alarm, which is good because my high pressure alarm goes off at 15 psig and my high at 20. So as the pressure is rising, those alarms are ordered correctly. Then I expect my SIF to react at 20 psig as well, and my rupture disk to lift at 60 psig. So these are in the correct order. The other thing I have to consider is, are they independent? And I would say that my high pressure alarm and my high pressure alarm most likely are not. So I'm going to specify a probability of failure for my high pressure alarm, but not my high pressure alarm. I could choose to delete my high pressure alarm, or I could leave it here and just not give it any credit. And this is really up to the user preference, but I would like to keep it here to help to have record of the fact that it was considered, we know it exists, but it's simply not independent. So I'll come in here to the edit button for my high pressure alarm, and I will notice that there is another database button here. And in this case, what you're seeing is the exida database for different independent protection layers and their data. So for alarm, we have alarm layer of protection with operator response. So for every alarm, we assume that somebody's going to respond to bring the process back to the safe state. And so again, we have all of our references, assumptions made, and the data point itself. And I can apply the data here. And then I have to double click the intersection in order to say that this IPL is responding to this initiating event. In cases where you have multiple initiating events, or you're looking at all of the multiple severity categories, being able to specify which protection layers are effective against the initiating event or the severity category is important. In cases where it is universally applicable, you can use this apply to all or unapply to all button. And so in this case, I just had to double click here, but I can use this as well. As I mentioned, I'm going to leave the high pressure alarm alone as NA and leave it at that. I'm going to skip this SIF for now because I don't know the probability of failure until I know the design of the SIF. And I don't know the target risk reduction factor until I see the entire hazard scenario and its calculation. So right now the hazard scenario frequency is 0.01. And for the rupture disk, I can come in here and give a probability of failure. I'm going to go to that same database, and I am going to select a pressure relief valve and use that data for the rupture disk. Double click here, and it'll update my calculation. So you can see that my resulting hazard scenario frequency is 1.1 e to the minus 4. It's not yet meeting my target frequency, and so I have a risk reduction factor of 11. A bit like this, without being able to give credit to the SIF, without knowing exactly what the achieved SIL or achieved RRF would be. Or I can come into the SIF and hit the calculator button. So I know the SIF applies. I'll select that and I'll hit the calculator button. And what that will do is it's forcing the hazard scenario frequency to meet the target frequency. And it's allocating that 11 risk reduction factor to my SIF. And so you can see that here. My RRF is 11 and my PFD is also filled out based on that RRF. And so this is really dipping a toe into the SIL selection phase, but it's doing so in the LOPA based off of the LOPA calculation. If I then go to the SIL selection tab, you would be able to see for my hazard scenario, the LOPA result here. And so you can see that 11 is calculated in the LOPA. I can then apply that to my target RF, and it will output my target SIL. If I want to be a little more conservative and bump this up to 100, I can do that as well, but you would be able to see exactly what was calculated within the LOPA. I'm going to have it be 11. If I go back to the LOPA and I deselect that calculator, you see the risk reduction factor of 11 is here. If I go to SIL selection, I see that here as well. And I can simply type in 11 here. So whatever your method for this is, you would be able to do that within exSILentia. Calculator. The only other thing I want to point out in the LOPA is that you are able to link recommendations. So my recommendation from the PHA is here, and I can link that. I can also choose to see it within my worksheet. And so if I want to say that this recommendation applies to this initiating event, I can double click here and it'll represent that with a priority there. You can also add additional recommendations in the LOPA module if needed. So selection, I would be able to move on to the SRS. And in the SRS, you'll be able to see, I have to indicate that it is indeed a SIF in order for it to move forward. You'll be able to see the SIF that I've defined. And here you'll be able to see the demand rate that was recorded for the SIF, and you'll be able to see my integrity requirements based off of what I just did in select. The rest of the fields you see here are different requirements that are defined by the standard as required within the Safety Requirement Specification. And so you want to make sure to address each. So if I go to the SIF that's already defined, you can see the SRS filled out. The nice thing about this is each field represents a requirement that you want to address. They're all mandatory and important to communicate to the design team before determining exactly what the SIF design should be. So in the middle pane, you'll see SIF-specific requirements. You can see the SIF name, description, and tag. And everything here is specific to this particular SIF. On this side, you can see general requirements for the entire safety instrumented system. And so you have the opportunity to define a purpose and scope. You have documents that you can add to the SRS. You have definitions and abbreviations that you can define to be included in the report that's generated. You can also define logic solver hardware requirements here, including the SIL capability, your failure requirements, interfaces, functional requirements, operational requirements, and environmental extremes. You'll see there is an opportunity to define custom data for this section. And so in the project configuration, you can put a set of custom data just for this. And that will give you the opportunity to document things that don't already have a field if you would like to do so. Next section is this application software requirements. And you can see we have application program requirements, performance, process variable validation, monitoring functionality, proof testing, application program failures, and so on. Again, you see that custom data opportunity. So you'll be able to define additional fields here if needed. Finally, you have general SIF requirements. And this is going to help to define requirements for your whole safety instrumented system, but also define requirements that are used in the SIF-specific requirements. You can define them once, and using these buttons, you will be able to transfer them to the SIF-specific section in the middle. And this would help you with any parameters that are consistent across the board, and you don't want to have to type them in for each SIF. In many cases, people have hundreds of SIFs, and that would be quite a lot of work. And so this almost gives you the opportunity to define defaults for your safety instrumented system. It can always be overwritten within this section in the middle, but it is a time saver if you find that many of the requirements are consistent across the board. You can also define custom data here that will be universal for the SIF and the specific SIF requirements as well. So once all of this is filled out, the report that is generated is nicely matching the UI of this module. And the reason this is nice is because there's a lot of information that's covered here, and you want to be able to have it easily accessible to the team that you're handing it off to. And so with so many requirements, if they're easy to find because they're in the same order or configuration as the module that you filled them out in, that is a little bit of a help. And so here you'll see the SRS report that is defined. I'll zoom in so you can see one page at a time. I have a table of contents right off the bat. The purpose and scope that you defined within the module will be shown here with project information and any standards that apply. You have your general SIS requirements, starting with your logic solver hardware requirements. And you'll see how this mimics both the order of the fields and exactly what categories they're in. So if you're familiar with the module, you'll know exactly where to find them in the report. Next is SIF application software requirements, and these should look familiar as well. We have high-level general SIF requirements. These are the ones that don't apply to the SIF-specific requirements. Then we have a high-level safety instrumented function list that's going to show the tag, the name, and the requirements for SIL and RRF. Then finally, the SIF-specific requirements are shown here. So you see how this is helpful to hand off to anyone that does not have access to exSILentia that needs to know the requirements. But also, if you return to the module, you'll see that the very next step is Silver. And when you go to define your entire SIF, you can easily refer back to the SRS to see exactly what the requirements are. So it's nice to have the analysis in the same tool as the design is done. And it's nice to have a nice, consistent way to define the requirements for the SRS so that they're easy to communicate out. So that, in a nutshell, is an overview of PHA, LOPA, SIL selection, and SRS. And that is how we would do it within exSILentia. So the demo is complete. And as I said earlier, if you have any questions on what you saw today in this webinar, please reach out and let me know. I'd be happy to answer your questions. We are going to have a part 2 that addresses the design phase and the operation and maintenance phase. So please attend that as well if you want to see exactly how you would model your SIFs in Silver, how you would consider cost, lifecycle cost. You want to optimize according to cost as well as reach your integrity requirements, how you would document the design SRS, and how you would move forward to do proof testing that is going to help to validate the assumptions you made in Silver and collect data over the life of your safety instrumented system. So that is to come, but thank you so much for attending today. I'm happy to show you exactly how we do this within exSILentia. And again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you.